What is your secret that you can't tell anyone because it will probably ruin your life? Story 1. 5 years before my stepdad died of Alzheimer's and leukemia, I began to notice subtle changes in him during my visits to their home. He had always been a quiet man, thoughtful and reserved, but in the evenings, his silence felt heavier, more deliberate. One night, as we sat in the living room, the TV murmuring in the background, I turned to him and asked, "Why don't you want to talk a bit more?" He looked at me, his eyes tired but kind, and said, "If I don't say anything, I can't say anything wrong." At the time, I took it to mean he was avoiding conflict with my mom. They had their disagreements, like any couple, and I assumed he was just trying to keep the peace. I told him, "I'd want to hear anything you have to say," hoping to encourage him to open up. He smiled faintly but didn't respond. I didn't push further. It wasn't until after his death that I fully understood the weight of his words. One memory, in particular, haunts me. It was a sunny afternoon, and the three of us were having lunch at their favorite cafe. My stepdad had been struggling to find the right words all morning, but he seemed determined to ask me something. He started a sentence, then paused, his brow furrowing. "Could you pass me the moon?" he finally said, gesturing vaguely toward the salt shaker. My mom burst out laughing. "Ha ha ha, now you've totally gotten things weird," she said, her voice light and teasing. She didn't mean any harm. She had no idea his confusion was a symptom of something far more serious. To her, it was just one of his silly mistakes, something to laugh about. But I saw the way his face fell, the way he shrunk into himself. He didn't try to speak again for the rest of the meal. That moment stayed with me, but I didn't fully grasp its significance until much later. My stepdad's condition worsened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. He began forgetting names, losing track of time, and struggling with simple tasks. My mom chalked it up to stress or aging, and so did I. We didn't want to believe it could be anything more. By the time he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, it was already advanced. The man who had once been so steady and reliable became a shadow of himself. There were days when he didn't recognize us, when he would stare at the walls for hours, lost in a world we couldn't reach. And then there were the nights, the worst nights, when he would scream in terror, his voice raw with a fear I couldn't begin to comprehend. My mom would sit with him, holding his hand, her own face streaked with tears. She never left his side, not even when it broke her. We buried him 2 weeks ago. The grief is still fresh, a raw wound that hasn't begun to heal. My mom is devastated, her grief a heavy, suffocating presence in the house. She mourns him deeply, and I know she carries guilt she can't articulate. I see it in the way she stares at his empty chair, in the way she flinches when someone mentions his name. She doesn't know how her laughter that day at the cafe shamed him, how it made him retreat into silence. And I will never tell her, not even in my angriest, most frustrated moments. It would destroy her, and it wouldn't bring him back. Instead, I've been doing everything I can to support her. My brother and his wife have been helping too. We've been spending time together at the family cabin, trying to find solace in the familiar rhythms of nature. I cook her favorite meals, tend to the garden, and sit with her on the porch as the sun sets. We don't talk much, but we don't need to. Sometimes, just being there is enough. One evening, as we sat by the fire, my mom broke the silence. "Do you think he knew how much we loved him?" she asked, her voice trembling. I reached over and took her hand. "Of course he did," I said. "He knew." She nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. I knew it would take time for her to forgive herself, to let go of the guilt she didn't even realize she was carrying. And I knew it would take time for me to forgive myself too, for not seeing the signs sooner, for not understanding the depth of his pain. As the days turned into weeks, we began to find small moments of peace. My mom started talking about him more, sharing stories from their early years together. She laughed as she recounted their first date, how he had spilled coffee all over his shirt and spent the rest of the evening trying to hide the stain. It was the first time I had seen her smile since his death, and it gave me hope. But there are still moments when the grief feels overwhelming. One night, I woke to the sound of her crying in the kitchen. I found her sitting at the table, clutching one of his old sweaters. "I just miss him so much," she whispered. I sat down beside her and wrapped my arms around her, letting her cry. There were no words to make it better, no magic fix for the pain. All I could do was be there, just as she had been there for him. In the weeks that followed, we began to find a new rhythm. We planted a tree in his memory, a sturdy oak that would grow tall and strong, just like he had been. We started a tradition of lighting a candle for him every evening, a small but meaningful way to keep his memory alive. And slowly, ever so slowly, we began to heal. I don't know if the pain will ever fully go away, but I do know that we'll get through it together. My stepdad may be gone, but his love and the lessons he taught us will always remain. And in those quiet moments, when the weight of his absence feels heaviest, I remind myself of the words he once said to me. If I don't say anything, I can't say anything wrong. Now, I understand. He wasn't just avoiding conflict. He was trying to protect us, even as he was slipping away. And in his silence, he taught me the importance of listening, not just to words, but to the spaces in between. Story 2. It's been 54 years since I made the decision that would forever alter the course of my life and the lives of so many others. I've carried this secret like a stone in my chest, heavy and unyielding. My childhood best friend's little brother, the boy I watched grow up, the man he became. He's my son. And his children, the ones who call me uncle, are my grandchildren. No one knows. Not my best friend, not her brother, not even my own family. I've buried the truth so deep that sometimes I can almost convince myself it never happened. Almost. It all started the summer I turned 17. My best friend, Clara, and I were inseparable. We spent every day together, riding bikes, exploring the woods, and dreaming about the future. Her family was like my second family, and her little brother, Tommy, was just a kid, barely 10 years old. But Clara's older sister, Margaret, was different. She was 19, beautiful, and mysterious in a way that made my teenage heart race. We never talked much, but there was always this tension between us, something unspoken but undeniable. One night, everything changed. Clara's parents were out of town, and Margaret was supposed to be watching Tommy. But Tommy was asleep, and Clara and I were in the living room, laughing over some silly movie. Margaret came downstairs, her cheeks flushed, and asked if I could help her with something in the garage. I followed her, not thinking much of it. But once we were alone, she kissed me. It was impulsive, reckless, and over almost as quickly as it began. We never spoke of it again. A few months later, Margaret left town. She told everyone she was moving to the city for a job, but I knew the truth. She was pregnant. And the baby, Tommy, was mine. She never told me directly, but the timing was too perfect to ignore. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I was too scared. Scared of what it would mean for Clara, for Tommy, for all of us. So I stayed silent. I watched Tommy grow up, pretending he was just my best friend's little brother, while inside, I was dying a little every day. Years passed. Margaret never came back, and Tommy never knew the truth. He grew into a kind, hard-working man, married the love of his life, and had 2 beautiful children. I became uncle to them, a title that filled me with both joy and guilt. I loved them fiercely, but every time I looked at them, I was reminded of the lie I was living. Then, last year, everything came crashing down. Tommy was diagnosed with leukemia. The doctors said he needed a stem cell transplant, and the family was tested to see if anyone was a match. When the results came back, I was the only one who matched. I didn't hesitate to donate, but the process forced me to confront the truth I'd been running from for decades. The doctors asked questions about our genetic connection, and I had to lie, weaving a web of half-truths to protect the secret I'd kept for so long. The transplant was successful, and Tommy recovered. But the experience shook me to my core. For the first time, I considered telling him the truth. He deserved to know, didn't he? But every time I tried to bring it up, the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain something like this? How could I risk destroying the life he'd built? One evening, after a family dinner, I found myself alone with Tommy. We were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, when he turned to me and said, "You've always been like a father to me. You know that?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell him everything, to confess the truth and beg for his forgiveness. But instead, I just nodded and said, "I love you, kid." As the months went by, I began to notice subtle changes in Tommy. He started asking more questions about his mother, about why she left and why she never came back. I could see the pain in his eyes, the longing for answers I couldn't give him. One day, he confronted me directly. "Uncle," he said, his voice trembling, "do you know something about my mom that you're not telling me?" I froze, my mind racing. This was my chance to come clean, to finally tell him the truth. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw the little boy I'd watched grow up, the man I loved like a son. I couldn't do it. I couldn't risk breaking his heart. So I lied. "No, Tommy," I said. "I don't know anything." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. The tension between us grew, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. But I couldn't bring myself to tell him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And so, I continue to carry this secret, this burden that grows heavier with each passing day. I watch my grandchildren play in the yard, their laughter filling the air, and I wonder if they'll ever know the truth. I wonder if they'll hate me for keeping it from them. But for now, I hold on to the hope that some secrets are better left buried. For their sake, if not for mine. Story 3. I didn't stop doing martial arts because I was annoyed that they took in a kids group and we were expected to help coach them while still paying for our own classes. That was frustrating, sure, but it wasn't the reason I quit. The truth is far more complicated, far more uncomfortable, and it's something I've never admitted to anyone until now. I stopped because fighting other men made me horny as hell, and that was not a context in which I wanted to interact with kids. It started innocently enough. I joined the dojo to learn self-defense, to channel my energy into something productive. I loved the discipline, the focus, the way my body moved with precision and power. But as I progressed, something shifted. Sparring became more than just a test of skill. It became charged with an intensity one didn't understand at first. The physicality of it, the way my opponent's body pressed against mine, the adrenaline and the sweat. It awakened something in me that I wasn't prepared to confront. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just the rush of competition, the natural high of pushing my limits. But the more I fought, the harder it became to deny the truth. The thrill wasn't just about the fight. It was about the men I was fighting, the way their muscles strained, the way their breath hitched when I pinned them. It stirred something deep inside me, something I couldn't control. I felt sick with guilt. These men weren't there for the same reasons I was. They saw sparring as a test of skill, a way to improve themselves. They trusted me to respect the boundaries of the fight, and I was betraying that trust in the worst way. I tried to push the feelings down, to focus on the techniques, but it was no use. The more I fought, the more I craved that rush, that forbidden connection. When the dojo introduced the kids group, I thought it might help. Coaching children would force me to focus on something other than my own desires. But it only made things worse. Watching the kids spar, seeing their innocence and enthusiasm, made me feel like a monster. How could I stand there, teaching them discipline and respect, when I couldn't even respect the boundaries of my own mind? The final straw came during a sparring session with one of the senior students. He was strong, skilled, and completely focused on the fight. But as we grappled, I felt that familiar heat rising in me, that shameful hunger I couldn't suppress. When the match ended, he clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Good fight, man." His words felt like a knife to my gut. He had no idea what I was feeling, no idea how twisted I was inside. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I realized how fucked up it was that I was fighting other guys for my sexual gratification while they just saw it as fighting, period. I was using them, even if they didn't know it. And the thought of being around those kids, of being trusted to guide them, made me feel even more disgusting. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't live with the shame. The next day, I quit. I told the sensei I was too busy with work, that I needed to focus on other things. He nodded, understanding, and wished me well. But as I walked out of the dojo for the last time, I felt no relief, only a deep, aching emptiness. In the weeks that followed, I tried to fill the void with other activities. I took up running, joined a book club, even tried yoga. But nothing gave me the same rush, the same sense of purpose. And yet, I couldn't go back. Not after what I'd realized about myself. One evening, I found myself standing outside the dojo, watching through the window as the kids practiced their forms. They looked so innocent, so full of potential. I wanted to be a part of that, to help them grow and learn. But I knew I couldn't. Not with the darkness I carried inside me. As I turned to leave, I bumped into one of the senior students. He smiled and said, "Hey man, we miss you in there. You were one of the best." His words cut deep. He had no idea why I'd really left. No idea how much I'd struggled. I forced a smile and said, "Thanks. Maybe I'll come back someday." But I knew I wouldn't. I couldn't. Fighting had become something shameful and disgusting to me. A reminder of the parts of myself I couldn't control. And so, I walked away, leaving behind the one thing that had ever made me feel alive. Now, years later, I still think about the dojo. I think about the men I fought, the kids I coached, and the person I used to be. I've tried to forgive myself, to move on, but the guilt lingers. Maybe someday I'll find a way to make peace with it. But for now, I carry the weight of my choices, knowing that some battles can't be won. They can only be walked away from. Story 4. I've been hiding the extent of my alcoholism from everyone since I was 15. Now, at 35, I'm 8 weeks sober. But no one knows. How could they? They've never known I had an alcohol issue to begin with. For 2 decades, I've been a master of disguise, a magician of misdirection. I've hidden bottles in places no one would think to look, perfected the art of appearing sober even when I was anything but, and built a life that seemed perfectly normal from the outside. But inside, I was drowning. It started innocently enough. At 15, I stole a bottle of vodka from my parents' liquor cabinet. I drank it alone in my room, the burn of it making me feel alive in a way I never had before. It was my escape, my secret weapon against the chaos of my teenage years. By the time I was in college, I was drinking every night, hiding it behind closed doors and carefully constructed excuses. "I'm just tired," I'd say when my speech slurred. "I'm not feeling well," I'd explain when I stumbled. And people believed me. Why wouldn't they? I was good at this. As the years went by, my drinking became more calculated. I learned how to pace myself in social situations, how to nurse a single drink for hours while secretly refilling my glass when no one was looking. I became the life of the party, the one who always had a drink in hand but never seemed drunk. But behind the facade, I was falling apart. I woke up every morning with a pounding headache, my hands shaking until I had my first drink. I lied to my boss, my friends, my family. I lied to myself. 8 weeks ago, something changed. I don't know if it was the blackout where I woke up in a stranger's apartment, or the time I drove home drunk and nearly hit a pedestrian, or the way my reflection in the mirror seemed to stare back at me with disgust. But something inside me snapped. I poured every bottle in my house down the drain and promised myself I'd stop. Just for a day, then a week, then a month, and now, 8 weeks. But no one knows. Not my coworkers, who've noticed I've been more focused lately but chalk it up to a new diet. Not my friends, who've commented on how I've been healthier but assume it's just a phase. And certainly not my family, who've never suspected a thing. I've become an expert at hiding my sobriety, just as I was an expert at hiding my drinking. I still go to bars with friends, ordering soda water with lime and pretending it's a gin and tonic. I still laugh at their jokes, still nod along when they complain about hangovers. But inside, I'm screaming. The hardest part is the loneliness. I want to tell someone, to share this victory with someone who understands. But how do you explain 2 decades of lies? How do you say, "I've been an alcoholic since I was a teenager, and no one noticed"? It feels like too much, like a burden I can't unload without destroying everything I've built. Last week, I went to my first AA meeting. I sat in the back, my hands clenched in my lap, and listened as people shared their stories. They talked about losing jobs, losing families, losing themselves. And I realized how lucky I've been. I never hit rock bottom, not in the way they did, but I came close. So close. After the meeting, a man approached me. He was older, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "First time?" he asked. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. It gets easier, he said, but you don't have to do it alone. His words stayed with me. I haven't gone back to another meeting yet, but I think about it every day. I think about the freedom of being honest, of letting someone see the real me. But I'm scared. Scared of what it will mean for my relationships, for my life. Scared of who I'll be without the lies. For now, I take it one day at a time. I wake up, I don't drink, and I go to bed. It's not much, but it's more than I've done in 20 years. And maybe, someday, I'll find the courage to tell someone the truth. Until then, I'll keep hiding, not my drinking, but my sobriety. And I'll keep hoping that one day, I won't have to hide anymore. Story 5. I have a bad back, and from time to time, it goes into a full spasm. It's one of those things I've learned to live with, though it's never easy. But nothing could have prepared me for the morning that changed everything. It's a story I've never told anyone, not even my closest friends. But here it is. It was a typical Saturday morning. My girlfriend, Sarah, was still asleep, and I was trying to get out of bed as quietly as possible. I swung my legs over the side, and as my foot hit the floor, it happened. My back went into a full spasm. The pain was blinding, and I froze, unable to move. But that wasn't the worst part. Somehow, in the midst of the spasm, a perfectly formed turd fell out the leg of my shorts and landed on the floor with a soft thud. Before I could process what had just happened, the pain in my back sent me tumbling forward. I landed right in the poop. The commotion woke Sarah, and she bolted upright in bed. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice groggy but concerned. She jumped out of bed and ran over to me, kneeling beside me on the floor. "Are you okay? What happened?" she asked, her eyes wide with worry. I panicked. My mind raced, and before I could think better of it, I blurted out, "The dog! The dog did it." Sarah looked at me, confused. "The dog? But we don't have a dog." I froze. In my desperation, I'd forgotten that we didn't even own a dog. My face burned with embarrassment, but I doubled down. I thought I saw a dog. Maybe it was a stray that got in. I don't know." Sarah stared at me for a moment, then burst out laughing. "Oh my God, you're serious? You think a stray dog broke in, pooped on the floor, and then left without us noticing?" I couldn't meet her eyes. "I don't know, okay? I was in a lot of pain." She helped me up, still giggling, and cleaned up the mess while I sat on the edge of the bed, my face in my hands. I was mortified, but Sarah seemed to find the whole thing hilarious. She teased me about it for weeks, calling me the dog whisperer, and asking if I'd seen any more mysterious strays around the house. But as time went on, the incident faded into the background. Sarah and I eventually broke up, and I never told her the truth. I've carried this secret with me ever since, too embarrassed to admit what really happened. But now, as I sit here writing this, I can't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Life has a way of humbling you when you least expect it, and sometimes, all you can do is laugh and blame the dog. Story 6. Every Christmas, my family gathers at my parents' house for a big, festive dinner. It's a tradition that's been going on for as long as I can remember, and one of the highlights of the evening is always my homemade eggnog. They rave about it every year, insisting it's the best they've ever had. Little do they know, it's just high-end store-bought eggnog with a couple of tiny pieces of eggshell carefully placed in the pitcher to make it look like I missed them when I strained it. It's my little secret, and it's been working like a charm for years. The first time I pulled this off was purely accidental. I was running late for the family dinner and didn't have time to make eggnog from scratch, so I grabbed a carton of the fancy stuff from the store. On a whim, I crushed up a bit of eggshell and sprinkled it in, thinking it would make the whole thing look more authentic. When my uncle took his first sip and said, "Wow, this tastes like it's straight from the farm," I knew I was onto something. Since then, it's become my signature holiday contribution. Every year, I show up with my pitcher of homemade eggnog, and every year, my family oohs and ahs over it. My cousin even started calling it legendary. It's become a running joke that I guard the recipe with my life, refusing to share it no matter how much they beg. It's a family secret, I always say with a wink, and they eat it up. But this year, things took an unexpected turn. My younger sister, Emily, decided she wanted to learn how to make it herself. "You can't keep this recipe to yourself forever," she said, cornering me in the kitchen. "What if something happens to you? The world needs this eggnog." I laughed it off, but she was persistent. She even bought me a fancy notebook and a set of pens, insisting I write down the recipe for her. I tried to dodge her requests, but she wouldn't let it go. "Come on," she said. "Just show me how you make it. I promise I won't tell anyone." I was running out of excuses. If I didn't come up with something soon, she was going to figure out my secret. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I staged an elaborate cooking demonstration the night before Christmas Eve. I bought all the ingredients for real homemade eggnog, including eggs, cream, and nutmeg, and set up my kitchen like I was filming a cooking show. Emily watched intently as I cracked eggs, whisked ingredients, and pretended to strain the mixture through a fine mesh sieve. Of course, I secretly swapped the real eggnog for the store-bought stuff when she wasn't looking, and I made sure to drop in a couple of eggshell pieces for authenticity. "Wow," Emily said as she tasted the final product. "It's even better than I remember. You're a genius." I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking I was in the clear. But then, on Christmas Day, disaster struck. Emily decided to surprise the family by making the eggnog herself. She stood proudly in the kitchen, holding up a pitcher and announcing, "I finally convinced him to teach me the recipe. Let's see if I did it justice." My heart sank as I watched her pour glasses for everyone. I knew it wouldn't taste the same. She'd followed the real recipe, not my fake one. Sure enough, the first sip was met with polite smiles and murmurs of, "It's good, but it's not quite the same." Emily looked devastated. "What did I do wrong?" she asked, turning to me. I felt a pang of guilt. I couldn't let her take the fall for this. So, for the first time in years, I came clean. "Okay, everyone," I said, holding up my hands. "I have a confession to make. The eggnog, it's not homemade. It's store-bought. I just added a few eggshells to make it look real." The room fell silent. Then, my uncle burst out laughing. "You've been pulling this off for years? That's brilliant." Soon, everyone was laughing, even Emily. "I can't believe I fell for it," she said, shaking her head. "You're such a sneaky jerk." From that day on, the eggnog became a running joke in our family. Every year, someone would bring a carton of store-bought eggnog and ceremoniously drop in a piece of eggshell, declaring it homemade. And every year, we'd all laugh, remembering the time I finally came clean. It turned out the real magic of the eggnog wasn't in the recipe. It was in the laughter and love we shared as a family. And honestly, that's the best tradition of all. Story 7. It was my nephew's 5th birthday party, and the house was packed with family, friends, and the chaotic energy of a dozen sugar-hyped kids. I'd been holding it in for hours, but the moment had finally come. I really had to go. I scanned the room, looking for an escape route, and noticed a basement bathroom tucked away in a quiet corner. Perfect. While everyone was distracted by cake and presents, I slipped downstairs unnoticed. The basement was dimly lit and smelled faintly of laundry detergent and old carpet. I closed the bathroom door behind me, locked it, and let nature take its course. What followed was, without exaggeration, a masterpiece of destruction. It was the kind of deuce that could peel paint, clear a room, and possibly violate a few environmental regulations. When I was done, I flushed, washed my hands, and crept back upstairs, confident that no one had noticed my absence. Fast forward to after the party. My sister-in-law, SIL, and brother-in-law, BIL, were in the kitchen, their faces twisted in disgust as they complained about the state of their bathrooms. "I can't believe they did that," my SIL said, her voice sharp with frustration. "They clogged the upstairs toilet and left the basement bathroom smelling like a sewer. It's been days, and the stink won't go away. We had to call a professional cleaner." I froze, a forkful of leftover cake halfway to my mouth. They were talking about me. Well, not me specifically. They had no idea it was me. But they were definitely talking about my handiwork. And here's the kicker. They were blaming another couple, distant relatives who had been at the party. Apparently, this couple had a reputation for being difficult, and my SIL and BIL had immediately pinned the blame on them. I mean, who does that? My BIL ranted, pacing the kitchen. It's so disrespectful. And the smell. It's like something died down there. I wanted to laugh, but I kept my face neutral, nodding along sympathetically. Inside, though, I was dying. They had no idea. None. And as the weeks went by, the story only grew more dramatic. Every time the topic came up, my SIL and BIL would get angrier, their accusations more pointed. They ruined the basement, my SIL said at one point. We had to replace the air filters and everything. I don't even want to invite them to the next family gathering. I felt a twinge of guilt, but not enough to come clean. I mean, how could I? They'd already built this whole narrative around the other couple. If I confessed now, it would only make things worse. So, I kept my mouth shut and let the mystery deepen. Over time, the basement incident became a family legend. My SIL and BIL would bring it up at every holiday, their anger never fading. Remember that time they destroyed our bathroom? They'd say, shaking their heads. Unbelievable. The other couple, meanwhile, had no idea they were being blamed. They'd show up to family events, completely oblivious, while my SIL and BIL shot them dirty looks across the room. It was equal parts hilarious and horrifying. And then, one day, it happened. My SIL and BIL were hosting another party, and I found myself standing in the basement again, staring at that fateful bathroom door. The memories came flooding back, and I couldn't help but smile. I'd gotten away with it for years, and no one was any the wiser. But as I stood there, a thought occurred to me. What if I did it again? What if I became the family's mystery pooper, leaving behind a trail of destruction that no one could ever explain? The idea was ridiculous, but also kind of tempting. After all, I'd already cemented my place in family lore. Why not lean into it? In the end, I decided against it. One legendary deuce was enough. But to this day, whenever I hear my SIL and BIL complaining about the basement incident, I can't help but feel a strange sense of pride. I may be a mystery pooper, but at least I'm a legend. And honestly, isn't that what family is all about? Story 8. It's been 3 years since I last spoke to my former best friend, Emily. 3 years since that night, her 21st birthday, when everything fell apart. I still don't know what happened. All I know is that we both got blackout drunk, smoked something I can't even remember, and woke up the next morning with a chasm between us that's never been bridged. She hasn't answered a single message I've sent since. Not one. And every night, I fall asleep in horror, replaying the fragments of that night in my mind, trying to piece together what went wrong. We'd been inseparable since middle school. Emily was the kind of friend who felt like family, the person I called when anything, good or bad, happened. We'd been planning her 21st birthday for months, and when the night finally arrived, we were both buzzing with excitement. We started at her apartment with a small group of friends, drinking and laughing as we got ready to go out. But somewhere between the pregame and the club, things spiraled out of control. I remember flashes of the night. Neon lights, loud music, shots lined up on the bar. I remember Emily laughing, her head thrown back, her eyes bright with joy. And then, nothing. Just darkness. The next thing I knew, I was waking up on her couch, my head pounding, my mouth dry. Emily was gone. Her roommate, Jess, was in the kitchen, avoiding eye contact. Emily left early, she said when I asked. She didn't say where she was going. I tried calling Emily, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I sent her a text, "Hey, last night was wild. Are you okay?" No response. I figured she was just hungover and needed space, so I went home. But days turned into weeks, and she still hadn't replied. I sent more messages, apologies, questions, pleas for her to talk to me. Nothing. I asked Jess if she knew what was going on, but she just shook her head. I don't know, okay? She doesn't want to talk about it. The silence was unbearable. Emily wasn't just my best friend. She was my person. And now she was gone, and I had no idea why. I replayed the night over and over in my head, trying to remember what I'd done, what I'd said. Had I hurt her? Had I said something unforgivable? The not knowing was worse than anything. Months passed, and I kept trying. I sent her birthday cards, left voicemails, even showed up at her apartment once, but she wouldn't answer the door. It was like I'd become a ghost to her, someone she could erase from her life without a second thought. The guilt ate at me. I started avoiding mutual friends, afraid they'd ask about her, afraid they knew something I didn't. I stopped going to our favorite coffee shop because it reminded me of her. I even deleted her number from my phone, not because I wanted to forget her, but because seeing her name in my contacts was too painful. And then, last year, I ran into Jess at a grocery store. She looked surprised to see me, and for a moment, I thought she might say something about Emily. But instead, she just nodded and walked away. It was like a punch to the gut. Even Jess, who'd always been kind to me, couldn't stand to be around me anymore. Now, 3 years later, I still think about Emily every day. I wonder if she's happy, if she ever thinks about me, if she's found someone else to fill the space I once occupied. I wonder if she'll ever forgive me, if she even knows what she's forgiving me for. A few weeks ago, I sent her one last message. I don't know what happened that night, but I'm sorry. I miss you. I hope you're doing okay. I didn't expect a response, and I didn't get one. But somehow, sending it felt like closing a door, like letting go of something I'd been clinging to for too long. I still fall asleep every night in horror, haunted by the mystery of what I did to lose her. But I'm starting to realize that maybe I'll never know. Maybe some doors are meant to stay closed. And maybe, just maybe, that's okay. Story 9. The story everyone knows is that my boyfriend, Jake, and I voluntarily left our jobs because our relationship went against company policy, and we decided our love was more important than a couple of crappy paychecks. It's a romantic tale, one that makes people smile and nod approvingly. Good for you, they say. You have to follow your heart. What they don't know is the truth. We got caught fucking in my car before work, and we left to avoid getting fired. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Jake and I had been dating for about 6 months, and we'd been careful to keep things professional at work. We worked in the same department, and while the company didn't explicitly forbid relationships, they strongly discouraged them. So, we kept our heads down, avoided PDA, and tried to act like we were just co-workers. But that morning, we got careless. We'd arrived at work early, as usual, and decided to kill some time in the parking lot. One thing led to another, and before we knew it, we were in the back seat of my car, completely oblivious to the world outside. That's when it happened. A sharp knock on the window startled us, and we looked up to see our manager, Greg, standing there, his face a mixture of shock and disapproval. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he barked, his voice muffled through the glass. We scrambled to get dressed, our faces burning with embarrassment. Greg didn't say much after that, just told us to meet him in his office in 10 minutes. We knew what was coming. We'd broken the rules, and now we were going to pay for it. But instead of waiting for the axe to fall, we decided to take control of the situation. We marched into Greg's office, handed in our resignations, and walked out with our heads held high. By the end of the day, the story had spread like wildfire. Jake and I had left our jobs for love. It was a narrative we didn't correct. In fact, we leaned into it, spinning it into a tale of romance and rebellion that made us the talk of the office. And eventually, our entire social circle. At first, it felt like a victory. We turned a humiliating situation into something people admired. But as the weeks went by, the weight of the lie started to settle in. Every time someone praised us for being so brave, I felt a pang of guilt. Every time Jake and I exchanged knowing looks, I wondered if we'd made the right choice. Things got even more complicated when Greg reached out to us a month later. He'd been fired for an unrelated incident, and he wanted to apologize for how he'd handled things that morning. "I shouldn't have been so harsh," he said over coffee. "I was just caught off guard. You guys didn't deserve to lose your jobs over it." His apology was unexpected, and it left us both feeling uneasy. We'd painted Greg as the villain in our story, but the truth was, he wasn't a bad guy. He'd just been doing his job. And now, he was out of work, while we were the ones being celebrated for our courage. The guilt gnawed at me, but Jake insisted we keep up the act. "What's done is done," he said. "We can't change it now. Besides, people love the story. Why ruin it?" I wanted to believe him, but the lie kept growing. When we landed new jobs, our coworkers wanted to hear the romantic story of how we'd met. When we moved in together, our friends toasted to our unconventional love. And when we got engaged last year, the tale of how we'd left it all behind for love became a central part of our narrative. But every time I look at Jake, I can't help but wonder if we're living a lie. Are we the brave, love-struck couple everyone thinks we are? Or are we just two people who got caught in a compromising position and spun it into a fairy tale? Last week, I found myself staring at our engagement photo on the mantle. We look so happy, so in love. But the guilt is still there, lurking beneath the surface. I don't know if I'll ever be able to let it go. Maybe one day, I'll tell someone the truth. Maybe one day, I'll stop feeling like a fraud. But for now, I'll keep smiling, keep nodding, and keep pretending that our love story is as perfect as everyone thinks it is. Story 10. I'm 40 years old, and my parents still have no idea that I never actually graduated college. It's a secret I've carried for nearly 2 decades, one that's shaped my life in ways I never could have imagined. To them, I'm a college graduate who chose not to walk the stage during the small winter ceremony. To me, I'm someone who faked it until I made it, and somehow, against all odds, it worked out. I started college with high hopes and even higher expectations. My parents were adamant that a degree was the only path to a decent job, and they drilled that into me from a young age. But as the years went by, I found myself drifting. School wasn't necessarily hard for me, but I couldn't bring myself to focus or dedicate myself to it. I changed majors twice, took semesters off, and eventually realized I was just going through the motions. By the time I hit my 6th year, I knew I wasn't going to graduate. But telling my parents wasn't an option. They'd invested so much, emotionally, financially, in the idea of me getting a degree. So, I came up with a plan. I graduated in a winter semester, telling my parents I decided not to walk the stage because the December ceremony was always small and underwhelming. They bought it without question. The recession in the 2000s gave me the perfect excuse for not landing a conventional job right away. I told them the job market was tough, and they nodded sympathetically, never suspecting the truth. In the years that followed, I worked odd jobs, building up experience and skills in fields that didn't require a degree. I learned to sell myself based on what I could do, not what I had on paper. And it worked. I landed a job at a company that valued experience and personality over formal education. Over time, I climbed the ladder, proving myself through hard work and dedication. Now, I have a great job, a stable life, and a future I'm proud of. But the lie is still there, hanging over me like a shadow. My parents are proud of me. They brag to their friends about my degree and my successful career. Every time they bring it up, I feel a pang of guilt, but I can't bring myself to tell them the truth. They're in their 70s now, and I don't want to shatter the image they have of me. I don't want to disappoint them, but the secret weighs on me. Last year, my dad made a comment that hit harder than most. "You know, your mom and I always worried about you when you were in college," he said over dinner. "You seemed so lost. But look at you now. You proved us wrong." I forced a smile and changed the subject, but his words stayed with me. They'd known I was struggling, but they'd never pushed me too hard. They trusted me to figure it out, and in a way, I had. Just not the way they thought. A few months ago, I found myself staring at my LinkedIn profile, the one that lists my degree under education. I thought about updating it, about finally coming clean. But then I thought about my parents, about the pride in their eyes when they talk about me, and I couldn't do it. Maybe one day, I'll tell them the truth. Maybe one day, I'll find the courage to admit that I didn't follow the path they wanted for me, but I still found my way. For now, though, I'll keep the secret. I'll keep smiling when they bring up my graduation, and I'll keep building the life I've worked so hard for. Because at the end of the day, it's not the degree that defines me. It's the person I've become. And that's something I can be proud of, even if it's built on a lie. Story 11. It all started when my dad pulled me aside one evening, his voice low and serious. "You can't tell anyone this," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. I nodded, intrigued and a little nervous. That's when he dropped the bombshell. My childhood best friend, Jake, has 2 siblings he doesn't know about. Twins. 2 years old. My jaw practically hit the floor. The story was wild. Apparently, Jake's dad, this larger-than-life sports prodigy, had been targeted by his former doctor, a woman who decided she wanted his superior genetics for her kids. She lied about being on birth control, got pregnant, and never even asked for child support. She just wanted the kids. It sounded like something out of a twisted movie, but my dad swore it was true. And now, here I was, holding on to this massive secret. At first, I tried to push it out of my mind. What could I even do with that information? I'd promised my dad I wouldn't say a word, and I wasn't about to break that trust. But every time I hung out with Jake, it felt like there was this invisible wall between us. He'd crack jokes about how he was an only child, and I'd force a laugh, my stomach twisting. It didn't help that Jake's dad was always around, his booming laugh filling the room like nothing was wrong. Then, one night, Jake called me up, his voice buzzing with excitement. "Dude, guess what? I just sent in one of those Ancestry DNA kits. I'm gonna find out if I'm, like, secretly royalty or something." My blood ran cold. I tried to play it cool, but my mind was racing. What if he found out about the twins? What if he found out I knew? The next few weeks were torture. Every time my phone buzzed, I was sure it was Jake, telling me he discovered the truth. I started avoiding him, making excuses not to hang out. I couldn't look him in the eye, not with this secret hanging over my head. And then, one evening, it happened. My phone lit up with a text from Jake. Asterisk, "Dude, you're not gonna believe this. We need to talk." Asterisk. My heart sank. I knew exactly what he was going to say. I just didn't know how I was going to face him. Story 12. It all began in 2002 when I decided to leave my job at the electronics manufacturing company. I had been there for years, but it was time for a change. I handed in my notice, packed up my desk, and walked out the door, thinking that was the end of it. Little did I know, it was only the beginning of the strangest chapter of my professional life. For the next 2 decades, my paychecks kept coming. Not just my salary, but all the incremental raises, annual bonuses, and even the quarterly magazine and Christmas card. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but when the payments continued month after month, year after year, I decided to keep quiet. After all, who would turn down free money? In 2022, I received a letter from the company. They were offering me a redundancy package due to departmental restructuring. The package was incredibly generous, including an £85,000 lump sum contribution to my pension fund. I couldn't believe my luck. I signed the paperwork, cashed the check, and thought that would finally be the end of it. But then, in March 2023, an invitation arrived in the mail. The company was celebrating its 75th anniversary, and I was invited to the grand event. I couldn't resist. I put on my best suit, walked into the venue, and was greeted with open arms. The free bar was flowing, the food was delicious, and the atmosphere was electric. I mingled with former colleagues, some of whom I hadn't seen in years, and not a single person realized I hadn't worked there for over 2 decades. It was surreal. The night was a blur of laughter, nostalgia, and a few too many glasses of champagne. As the evening wound down, I found myself chatting with the CEO, a man I had only ever seen in the company magazine. He clapped me on the back and said, "It's great to see you here. You've been such a loyal employee over the years." I smiled, nodded, and raised my glass in a silent toast to the administrative error that had kept me on the payroll for so long. As I left the event, I couldn't help but wonder how long this charade could last. Would someone eventually realize the mistake? Or would I continue to receive paychecks, magazines, and Christmas cards for the rest of my life? Only time would tell, but for now, I was content to enjoy the ride. After all, you've got to love a good administrative error. Story 13. The journey began when I finally found the courage to leave an abusive relationship. It was the hardest decision I ever made, but I knew it was the only way to protect myself and my children. We started over in a new town, with nothing but the clothes on our backs and a determination to build a better life. It wasn't easy, but we managed. I worked long hours, juggled multiple jobs, and did everything I could to provide for my kids. For years, I told myself that as long as they were safe and happy, it was worth it. Then, just as I thought we were finally finding our footing, I was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. The news hit me like a freight train. I had already been through so much, and now this? I felt like life was mocking me, testing me to see how much I could take. But I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. My kids still needed me, so I put on a brave face and started treatment. Chemo, radiation, surgeries. It was a grueling process, and I was exhausted in every way imaginable. This week, my youngest child turns 18. It's a milestone I've been looking forward to for years, but now that it's here, I feel a strange mix of relief and emptiness. I've done what I set out to do. I've raised my kids, kept them safe, and given them a chance at a better life. But what about me? I'm so tired of being strong, of fighting battles I didn't ask for. Some days, I just want to let go, to stop carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. One evening, after a particularly rough day of treatment, I sat down and wrote a post online, pouring out my heart in a way I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. I didn't expect much, maybe a few kind words, if I was lucky. But when I woke up the next morning, my inbox was flooded with messages of support. Strangers from all over the world shared their own stories of struggle and survival, offering encouragement and reminding me that I wasn't alone. Their words touched me in a way I hadn't anticipated. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen, understood. It didn't magically erase the pain or the exhaustion, but it gave me a glimmer of hope. Maybe I didn't have to carry everything by myself. Maybe it was okay to lean on others, even just for a little while. As the days passed, I found myself drawing strength from the kindness of those who had reached out. I started to take things one day at a time, focusing on small victories instead of the overwhelming challenges. I celebrated my youngest's 18th birthday with a quiet family dinner, savoring the moment and the love that surrounded me. The road ahead is still uncertain, and I know there will be tough days. But for now, I'm choosing to hold on to the hope that things can get better, even if it's just a little bit at a time. Life has thrown me more than my fair share of curveballs, but I'm still here, still fighting. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Story 14. It was a typical university bush party. Loud music, bonfires, and the kind of chaos that only a crowd of drunk college students could create. I was there with my friends, laughing, drinking, and letting loose after a long week of classes. The night was a blur of flashing lights and pounding bass, but one moment cut through the haze like a knife. I was stumbling away from the main crowd, looking for a quiet spot to catch my breath, when I heard it, a scream. It was faint, muffled by the noise of the party, but it was unmistakable. My heart raced as I followed the sound, my instincts screaming that something was wrong. I found the source of the scream coming from a small tent tucked away in the shadows. I yanked open the flap and froze. Inside, I saw a guy on top of a girl, her cries for help drowned out by the chaos outside. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I just acted. I grabbed him by the shoulders, pulled him off her, and started swinging. His pants were around his ankles, and he was defenseless. My fists connected with his face, his body, over and over until I lost count. I don't remember much after that, just flashes of rage, the sound of my own breathing, and the sickening crunch of impact. When I finally came to my senses, he was lying motionless on the ground, blood pooling beneath his head. The girl was gone. I never saw her face, never learned her name. I stumbled out of the tent, my hands shaking, my knuckles swollen and bleeding. I wandered back to the party, my mind racing. What had I done? Had I killed him? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I drank until I blacked out, hoping to erase the memory of what had happened. The next few days were a blur. I avoided the news, avoided talking to anyone about it. I kept waiting for the police to show up at my door, but they never did. No one came forward. No one saw anything. The girl in the tent never spoke up, and I didn't blame her. I didn't even know her name. The guy, I later learned, was in a coma for a couple of days, but eventually recovered. I never faced any consequences, other than a broken knuckle that never quite healed right. Years passed, and I tried to move on. I graduated, got a job, built a life. But I could never forget that night. I found him on Facebook once, out of morbid curiosity. He looked happy, smiling in photos with his wife and 2 kids. He had no idea who I was, no idea that I was the one who had nearly ended his life that night. It was surreal, seeing him like that. Part of me wanted to reach out, to apologize, to explain. But what would I even say? Sorry I almost killed you, but you deserved it. It didn't feel right. I've thought a lot about that night over the years. I've wondered if I did the right thing, if I went too far. I've come to realize that violence isn't the answer, no matter how justified it feels in the moment. That night, I acted on instinct, on rage, and I came dangerously close to crossing a line I could never come back from. If I could go back, I'd do things differently. I'd call out the behavior before it escalated. I'd intervene in a way that didn't involve nearly killing someone. But I can't change the past. All I can do is learn from it. Now, I try to focus on preventing situations like that from happening in the first place. I speak up when I see something wrong. I call out toxic behavior before it spirals out of control. I've learned that the best way to fight injustice isn't with fists, but with awareness, education, and action. That night changed me, and while I'll always carry the weight of what I did, I'm determined to use that experience to make a positive difference in the world. Story 15. For as long as I could remember, people had always described me as kind, patient, and easygoing. I was the friend who listened without judgment, the coworker who always offered to help, the neighbor who smiled and waved no matter how busy I was. But the truth was, I didn't feel like that person. Not really. I was just acting the way I thought I was supposed to, following the script of social norms, playing the role of the nice guy because it was expected of me. Inside, though, I felt hollow. Every interaction outside my home left me exhausted, drained, and longing to retreat into solitude. It started to weigh on me more and more. The constant effort to be polite, to smile, to engage in small talk. It felt like wearing a mask that was slowly suffocating me. I began to dread social events, even simple ones like grabbing coffee with a friend or attending a work meeting. I'd come home afterward and collapse on the couch, feeling like I'd run a marathon. My partner would ask how my day was, and I'd force a smile and say, "Fine." But inside I was screaming. One day, after a particularly draining team-building workshop at work, I couldn't take it anymore. I locked myself in the bathroom, sat on the edge of the bathtub, and stared at the floor. My reflection in the mirror looked tired, defeated. Who are you even doing this for? I asked myself. The answer was unclear. I wasn't sure if I was doing it for the approval of others, out of fear of being judged, or simply because I didn't know how to be any other way. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living like this. That night, I decided to make a change. I started small, setting boundaries with people who demanded too much of my time and energy. I stopped saying yes to every invitation and began prioritizing my own needs. It felt uncomfortable at first, almost selfish, but I reminded myself that I wasn't doing anyone any favors by pretending to be someone I wasn't. Slowly, I started to feel a little lighter, a little more like myself. As time went on, I began to explore what it meant to be authentic. I started journaling, trying to untangle the web of expectations I'd internalized over the years. I realized that a lot of my behavior was rooted in a fear of rejection, a fear that if I stopped being nice, people would stop liking me. But the more I allowed myself to be honest, the more I discovered that the people who truly mattered in my life accepted me for who I was, not who I pretended to be. One day, I had a conversation with a close friend that changed everything. We were sitting in a quiet cafe, and I found myself opening up about how I'd been feeling. I don't think I'm as nice as everyone thinks I am, I admitted. My friend looked at me for a long moment, then smiled. You don't have to be nice all the time, they said. You just have to be you. That's enough. Those words stuck with me. I realized that I didn't owe anyone an endless supply of kindness or patience. I wasn't a character in a play, performing for an audience. I was a person, with my own needs, my own limits, and my own truth. And that was okay. Now, I'm learning to navigate the world in a way that feels authentic to me. I still smile and wave at my neighbors, but only when I feel like it. I still help my coworkers, but not at the expense of my own well-being. And when I come home at the end of the day, I no longer feel like I've been pretending to be someone I'm not. I'm still figuring it out, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm on the right path.